Empires rose, thrones fell, yet their rulers left stories time could never erase. Welcome to a new story. Let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's begin the untold journey of crowns, power, and history. The woman the court feared as king was not born into safety. Tamar of Georgia came into the world around 1160, the only child of King George III and Queen Berda. Her birth did not carry the assurance of a clear succession. In a royal court shaped by tradition, conquest, and the powerful expectations of male inheritance, her existence marked the beginning of a quiet tension. From the moment she could walk the stone corridors of the palace in Kutaisi, she did so under watchful eyes, not only of caretakers, but of lords and courtiers, measuring her against a future they did not yet accept. Tamar's royal blood granted her education in statecraft and theology, but her gender placed her at the edge of legitimacy. Even as a girl, she witnessed the unrest that clung to her father's rule. George III had spent his reign defending his crown from rebellious nobles who had grown powerful and impatient during his predecessor's reigns. His decision to name Tamar as co-ruler in the 1170s, while still alive and reigning, was not a signal of certainty. It was a warning flare. The coronation of Tamar as co-sovereign was held at the Galati monastery. It was symbolic, sacred, and deeply political, but the gesture carried consequences. To many nobles, it was an offense to custom. The idea of a woman sharing power in Georgia was not unprecedented, but this co-rule, performed before her father's death, was a direct challenge to the informal alliances that governed the court. Tamar's elevation, though cloaked in the language of divine right, was seen as the act of a king who did not trust the nobility to secure his daughter's future. It fractured loyalties that had already been strained. Behind the banners and ceremonies, the aristocracy murmured. Some doubted her strength, others questioned her right, but all knew that the king's choice had narrowed their future options. George III ruled for several more years, and during that time, Tamar remained in the background, learning. Her position as co-ruler gave her access to affairs of state, to envoys, decrees, and military councils. But it did not give her authority. That would come only with his death in 1184. When it finally came, the transfer of power was formal. Tamar was crowned again, this time as sole ruler. The nobles gathered in the cathedral, but many did so in silence. Her reign began not with celebration, but with calculation. Powerful families like the Makagadzeli and the Obeli saw opportunity in her youth and inexperience. They believed she could be molded, influenced, even controlled. Some prepared petitions, others prepared alliances. Yet Tamar did not challenge them directly. Her early reign was marked by quiet observation and strategic patience. She upheld the ceremonial functions expected of her. She maintained continuity in the royal court. But beneath the rituals, she began forming relationships, identifying advisors she could trust, allies who had no interest in seeing her replaced. Still, the memory of her father's defensive reign lingered, and many wondered whether the kingdom had passed from iron into softness. For all her education, for all her lineage, Tamar remained untested. In the eyes of her adversaries, her reign had begun with borrowed legitimacy, and before the throne beneath her had cooled, some were already moving to take it back. Tamar's first years as sole ruler were shadowed by limits she did not choose. Though crowned with all the rights of sovereignty, her power was quickly boxed in by the same nobles who had watched her rise with unease. The court that had once bowed to her father now moved to reshape her reign before it could truly begin. The Orbeliani and other leading aristocratic houses, their influence hardened by generations of privilege, formed a quiet coalition. They insisted on oversight under the name of tradition and piety, framing their interference as guidance. But beneath the surface, their aim was to control her decisions, her alliances, and her crown. Her appointments were questioned. Her signatures required approval. Her court became divided, those loyal to the queen and those loyal only to the memory of male rule. Tamar, still early in her 20s, was forced to navigate a government where her authority had been reduced to formality. The clearest sign of this imbalance came in the matter of marriage. The nobles pushed for an alliance with Yuri Bogolyubsky, a prince of Rus with royal blood but a tarnished past. Once the husband of a Byzantine princess, he had been cast out from Kiev and lived in obscurity. To Tamar's opponents, he was useful, foreign, ambitious, but ultimately controllable. His military background offered the illusion of strength beside the queen, while his lack of local roots ensured he would depend on the nobles for his position. The church sanctioned the marriage in 1185, and Yuri entered Georgia not as a partner, but as a weapon. His arrival was framed as protection. In reality, it was an effort to limit the queen's independence. The political consequences followed quickly. Yuri was given command of armies and influence in court affairs. His behavior, aggressive, unstable, and increasingly brutal, disturbed not only Tamar's inner circle, but the clergy and population as well. Behind the palace walls, his treatment of those closest to the queen raised alarms. His drunkenness, his use of violence, and his disregard for Georgian customs weakened the very legitimacy the nobles had hoped to preserve. What had been presented as a stabilizing alliance began to show cracks. The church, initially complicit, began to distance itself. Some nobles who had once supported the marriage grew silent. Others, quietly, began to question whether the queen might act. But Tamar did not confront them with noise. She did not issue public threats or declarations. Instead, she turned inward, strengthening relationships with allies who had been overlooked, building favor with the clergy, and granting new roles to families outside the central nobility. Figures like Zakaria Makagadzeli rose not only through loyalty, but through a new kind of merit. Tamar began to reward discretion, discipline, and unshaken allegiance to the crown. These choices slowly shifted the power structure of the court. The very men who had tried to box her in found themselves excluded from key decisions. By the time she moved to annul her marriage, she had already secured the legal and spiritual support to do so. The repudiation of Yuri was more than a personal decision. It was a political strike. For the first time since her father's death, Tamar asserted her authority not just with the crown, but through it. She had allowed the nobles to expose themselves, to make their alliances clear. Now she would no longer ask for room to rule. She would take it, and the court that had once believed it could contain her would soon face a different kind of queen. The dismissal of Yuri Bogolyubsky marked a defining moment in Tamar's rule, one not simply of personal separation, but of sovereign assertion. In the face of centuries of precedent, Tamar acted where no woman had before. The marriage that had been forced upon her as a safeguard had become a threat to both the monarchy and the stability of the realm. Yuri's conduct, marked by cruelty, drunkenness, and growing political recklessness, had turned a diplomatic alliance into a domestic crisis. As unrest grew beneath the surface, Tamar moved with deliberate precision. She secured the backing of the Georgian Orthodox Church, whose blessing had once legitimized the union. Its support for the annulment signaled a quiet yet powerful shift in moral authority. She also relied on the loyalty of select nobles, whose fortunes had begun to rise through her appointments. Figures who had watched her carefully build her own network, while the older aristocracy overplayed its hand. Yuri was exiled with no drawn sword, no public confrontation. His removal came through decree and consensus, not spectacle. But the message carried through every corridor of power. Tamar no longer ruled alongside any man. The crown she wore now belonged to her alone. The court, once divided between those who questioned her capacity and those who merely tolerated it, began to change. The voices that had once advised restraint fell quiet. Into their place came men of the frontier, generals from the outer provinces, commanders from mountainous strongholds, loyal not to bloodlines or tradition, but to the sovereign who had proven her will. One of the most notable among them was David Soslan, a prince of Alania and seasoned warrior, whose eventual rise would bring both military strength and dynastic stability. But even before his formal arrival, the structure of Tamar's court was already being redefined. The removal of Yuri was not the end of Tamar's struggle with him. Across the northern frontier, beyond the Caucasus Mountains, Yuri did not fade into obscurity. Stripped of title and influence, he sought allies among the discontented. Foreign mercenaries and scattered Georgian nobles who had lost their grip on power began to gather around him. Some were fueled by revenge, others by ambition. His exile became a seed of rebellion. But within Georgia, Tamar pressed forward. Her court now moved in rhythm with her decisions. She invested in legal reforms, restored lands seized during earlier feudal conflicts, and elevated new voices into the council. The nation began to reflect the ruler who governed it, measured, firm, and increasingly unified under a single authority. Behind every reform and appointment was a calculated effort to distance the crown from the web of noble families that had once held it hostage. Tamar's governance was no longer reactive. It had become intentional. Every shift in the court structure reduced the space her enemies once occupied. Every dismissal made the monarchy more centralized. What had started as a response to chaos became a framework for control. The court, once a place of uncertain balance, now revolved around a queen who no longer asked for legitimacy. She exercised it. And beyond Georgia's borders, those who had once doubted her were beginning to reassess what kind of monarch they now faced. In 1191, the rebellion came not from a distant border, but from the past Tamar had already cast out. Yuri Bogolyubsky returned to Georgia with northern forces at his back, mercenaries and supporters drawn from the fractured lands of the Rus. But he did not march alone. His presence reignited the ambitions of those within Georgia who had never accepted Tamar's authority. Among them were disaffected nobles and former allies of the Orbeliani family, men whose influence had eroded under Tamar's rule, and who now saw a chance to reclaim their lost ground by installing Yuri as a puppet sovereign. This was no invasion from foreign soil. It was a movement cloaked in memory, Seeking to reverse the order Tamar had spent years building. The rebellion's message was clear. Tamar's rule was unnatural, unstable, and reversible. The attack was launched under the pretense of restoring tradition, yet its real aim was to fracture the central power that had begun to assert itself too strongly. Cities in eastern Georgia became flashpoints. Fortresses that had once flown Tamar's banners shifted allegiance under pressure or quiet persuasion. Even among the clergy, dissent echoed in whispers. Tamar had ruled with diplomacy and law, but now she faced a campaign designed to test the limits of both. The court in Kutaisi did not erupt in panic, but it tightened. Eyes narrowed. Every decision was watched for weakness. Tamar's response was deliberate. She summoned the military loyalty she had cultivated in silence. Commanders like Zachariah Makagadzeli, whose rise had come through Tamar's reshaping of the court, became her shield. Unlike the old nobility, these men were not born into power. They had earned it. Zachariah and his forces moved quickly to suppress rebel pockets before they could gather strength. Battles broke out near the Aragvi River and in the valleys of eastern Georgia. Each skirmish held more than just territorial value. It tested whether the Queen's reforms had taken root, or whether loyalty could still be bought with promises of old privilege. But the battlefield was not the only front. Inside the palace, loyalties bent under pressure. Some lords offered only quiet support, waiting to see which side would prevail. Tamar's inner circle began to shift in tone. Requests became demands, and silence carried suspicion. Even among those who stood by her, there were questions spoken in private chambers. Could a queen truly hold the kingdom through war, not just wisdom? The uncertainty crept behind the armor of discipline. Tamar, who had once been underestimated for her gentleness, now faced scrutiny for her strength. And then a letter arrived, its contents not widely recorded, but its effects clearly seen. Written from within the rebel ranks and delivered under guarded conditions, the message revealed fractures inside Yuri's coalition. Promises made to lords had not been kept. Foreign mercenaries had begun to quarrel over payment. Support that had once surged was weakening from within. The timing was crucial. Tamar ordered a concentrated strike on Yuri's stronghold near Tamogvi. The rebel force broke. The prince who had once been called king fled again into exile. But even in victory, the scars of the rebellion remained. Tamar had held her crown. She had silenced a rebellion raised in her name. Yet the war had exposed something deeper, a court that still carried the weight of older loyalties, and a queen who could not always be certain, who walked beside her out of faith, and who remained only out of fear. In the spring of 1195, Tamar's kingdom faced an external threat that tested the strength she had built within. The Seljuk ruler of Azerbaijan, Abu Bakr, of the Ildigizid dynasty, launched an invasion into Georgian territory with the backing of Muslim allies from the region. The incursion was framed as retaliation, partly for Tamar's rising power, partly for Georgia's support of her nephew's rule in Shavan, but its true motive was strategic. Georgia had grown too bold. Its trade routes, its border fortresses, and its sovereign queen had begun to shift the balance of power in the Caucasus. Abu Bakr moved with speed and scale, crossing the Araxes River with an army equipped for winter siege and desert warfare alike. His message was clear. The golden age Tamar was building would be challenged by fire. Tamar's response was swift and absolute. She entrusted the command of her forces to her second husband and closest military ally, David Soslan. His leadership, already tested in previous conflicts, was now placed under the weight of defending not just territory, but the very legitimacy of Tamar's reign. Georgian forces marched eastward, reinforced by allies from Shirvan and the Armenian frontier. The campaign took shape near Shamkor, a strategic location in present-day Azerbaijan. As the armies met, snow still clung to the highlands. The ground was frozen, the air sharp with wind. But Tamar's army moved with resolve, structured around a system of regional commanders who had risen under her reforms. What unfolded was not a single clash, but a series of tightly coordinated attacks that dismantled the Seljuk lines. The victory at Shamkor was complete. Georgian forces penetrated deep into enemy formations, captured high-ranking Seljuk commanders, and seized weapons, armor, and standards. The psychological impact reverberated far beyond the battlefield. For the first time, Muslim powers in the east had been decisively repelled by a Christian queen's command. Envoys from distant courts, Armenian, Byzantine, and even Latin, took notice. Tamar's name moved beyond local diplomacy and entered broader political conversation. But behind the glory stood silence. Hundreds of Georgian soldiers had fallen, many of them young nobles whose names filled the records of the royal chancery. Their bodies were left on the white plains, buried in haste or not at all. Tamar, though far from the front lines, received the casualty reports in the quiet of her halls. Each name carried a family, a province, a village. Each loss was a price she had accepted for the future she was building. The triumph changed more than perception. It shifted the internal structure of governance. Generals who had proven themselves at Shamkor gained increased influence. Their families elevated into new political ranks. The crown lands expanded. Military outposts were reinforced. Roads to the eastern frontier were rebuilt, not just for defense, but to carry the message of Georgia's strength outward. Yet even as Tamar consolidated this new power, another kind of challenge began to rise, not from an army, but from within the expectations her own victory had created. The question was no longer whether she could rule. It was how far her rule would reach, and how much silence she would have to carry with her as it did. By the dawn of the 13th century, the Kingdom of Georgia stood transformed. Under Queen Tamar's command, its borders extended from the shores of the Black Sea to the edges of the Caspian. Vassal states, tributary rulers, and frontier principalities bowed to Tbilisi, sending gold, grain, and allegiance to the throne. Trade routes, once fractured by tribal conflict, were reconnected, drawing silk from the east and coin from the west. Cities expanded. Monasteries rose with stone walls, and scriptoria filled with scholars and illuminated texts. The royal treasury overflowed. From the outside, it was a golden age. And to the poets and historians who wrote under royal patronage, Tamar became not just a sovereign, but a symbol, praised in verse as both king and queen, just and invincible. But inside the palace, where the echo of footsteps carried too far, the weight of empire pressed differently. Victory had not made Tamar untouchable. It had made her a larger target. With every campaign, she absorbed new territory, and with it, new resentments. Local lords from the Caucasus, Armenian highlands, and eastern steppes swore loyalty but watched closely. Some remained loyal only as long as they were needed. Others waited for signs of weakness. The administration of such a vast domain required layers of bureaucracy, scribes, envoys, tax collectors, and each layer created new chances for sabotage, corruption, or silent rebellion. Tamar understood that power was no longer about force alone. It was about perception, surveillance, and control. To hold an empire together, she had to see everything and trust no one completely. The court began to shift under that awareness. Advisors grew more formal. Ceremonies lengthened. Communication from the provinces was increasingly filtered through layers of officials. As Tamar's stature rose, access to her became limited. But the physical barriers did not quiet the rumors. In the very halls she had once walked freely as co-ruler, she now moved behind veils and protocols. The reverence that had once been offered as a gesture of honor began to resemble fear. The guards doubled. Messengers arrived unannounced. Reports of conspiracies, some real, some imagined, arrived with increasing frequency. Secret inquiries were conducted in silence. Suspicions, once whispered in corners, now traveled in coded letters and intercepted conversations. Tamar's court became an engine of vigilance, sharpened by its own success. And still, she governed. She appointed new bishops to strengthen the church. She directed the restoration of ancient monasteries across Tau and Glageti. She oversaw the expansion of trade roads through the mountains, connecting her realm to Armenia, Shirvan, and beyond. But every decree carried a cost. Loyalty had to be bought, not assumed. To maintain stability, she elevated regional commanders whose ambitions, if left unchecked, might one day threaten the throne itself. The empire she had built gleamed in gold-leafed manuscripts and stone-carved archways. But beneath the surface, the mechanisms of rule grew heavier. The palace, once a center of light, became a place of shadows. By 1202, Tamar had reached the height of her influence. But as her gaze turned toward the west, toward the fractured Byzantine world, the court sensed a change. Ambition had brought unity. Now, it began to stir something else. Silence in council meetings, coded exchanges between envoys, and the subtle erosion of trust that no victory could reverse. The threat that approached would not arrive on horseback. It would move quietly, from within. In 1204, Queen Tamar made a calculated move to secure the future of her dynasty. She arranged the formal coronation of her son, George Lasha, as co-ruler. The ceremony was not merely symbolic. It was a signal to the court, the clergy, and neighboring states that the Bagrationi line would continue beyond her. At just over 16 years of age, George stood beside his mother, not as an heir waiting in silence, but as a young king in training. Tamar remained sovereign in full authority. But this transition marked a subtle redistribution of visibility and power. It brought stability to a realm now spanning vast and volatile territories, but also invited a wave of quiet unrest beneath the surface. For some in the court, the coronation stirred uncertainty. Generals who had risen through Tamar's personal trust now faced the ambiguity of serving two rulers. Court officials adjusted their allegiances with caution, unsure whether George's inexperience might soon open new paths for influence. Tamar's consolidation of power had brought discipline to the court, but the introduction of a second figure, one young, untested, and emotionally distant from the older factions, fractured the careful balance she had built. To foreign envoys, the ceremony affirmed continuity. To certain Georgian nobles, it suggested an approaching vacuum. The tension did not erupt publicly. It moved in whispers, changes in protocol, shifts in seating, altered routes for couriers. Rumors of disagreements between George's advisors and his mother's council became harder to dismiss. Tamar, known for her deliberate poise, continued to preside over matters of state with her usual clarity. She signed treaties with neighboring rulers and received emissaries from distant courts who brought gifts, requests, and intelligence. Yet behind her command, the palace grew uneasy. A forged letter surfaced, delivered under unknown circumstances, its contents unrevealed in surviving records. But its effect was immediate. Meetings were postponed, audiences were shortened. Several court figures were removed without public explanation. The political atmosphere, once firm, began to hollow. Dissent took on new forms, not open defiance, but passive evasion, refusals to act, silence in moments that required response. George, newly crowned, began to feel the weight of command without its authority. His hesitation showed in the pauses before his orders, in the glances exchanged between commanders when his seal appeared on military dispatches. Tamar recognized the fragility that had emerged, but the machinery of succession could not be undone. Her decision had stabilized the state on paper, but in practice, it had begun to fray the trust that held its leaders together. Through this uncertainty, the threat became less visible but more present. The court no longer knew exactly where danger lived. Some suspected foreign agents, others blamed internal rivalries, and some feared that the ambitions of a younger generation had simply outgrown the boundaries Tamar had set. Nothing in the archives points to a single betrayal, but the effect was clear. Authority no longer moved with the same unity. Between the wine cups raised in celebration and the folded scrolls passed in secret, a quiet blade had entered the court, and the hand that held it remained unseen. In the final years of her reign, Tamar turned her attention westward. The once mighty Byzantine Empire had collapsed into internal disarray, weakened by dynastic infighting and the fall of Constantinople to the forces of the Fourth Crusade in 1204. In its place, rival powers scrambled to claim its legacy. Among them was the Empire of Trebizond, a new state rising on the southern shore of the Black Sea. It was no accident. Tamar's hand had shaped its foundation. She directed Georgian support toward her exiled relatives from the Komnenos line, encouraging their return to claim territory long contested between Byzantium and Georgia, with Georgian troops escorting them and her authority behind their claim. Alexios Komnenos took Trebizond and declared it an empire. It was a calculated move, part restoration, part retaliation. Tamar had not forgotten the political slights her family had endured at the Byzantine court. But more than that, she saw the moment as a final extension of Georgian power, one last breath of expansion under her command. Tamar no longer rode with her armies. Age had crept in quietly, not with spectacle, but with the slow erosion of strength. Her health began to decline in the early 1200s. The details were not widely recorded. In Georgian chronicles, her body is not described in suffering, only in absence. But as the Empire of Trebizond took shape under Georgian influence, the queen remained at the center of its political creation. Her messengers rode between Tbilisi and the Black Sea coast with orders, letters, and sealed envoys. Even as illness pressed closer, Tamar dictated with clarity. Her commands were honored not out of habit, but out of reverence. She had led through war and through diplomacy, and now, even as her strength faded, her decisions moved armies and redrew borders. The court around her continued to function, George IV, already crowned co-ruler, began to take on more ceremonial duties. But Tamar remained the sovereign voice in matters of foreign strategy. Her presence lingered in every treaty signed and every envoy received. Yet those closest to the center of power began to notice the quiet changes. Audience times shortened. Fewer advisors were granted personal access. The palace grew still for longer hours. Though the state functioned, something essential had begun to withdraw. Her letters, once copied in triplicate and dispatched before sunrise, became less frequent. Those who carried them did so with greater urgency, knowing they might be the last to bear her seal. The creation of the Empire of Trebizond marked the final political stroke of Tamar's life. It secured a buffer on Georgia's western flank and ensured that a friendly dynasty held sway over a vital stretch of coastline. But it also symbolized a closing arc. The queen who had risen in defiance, ruled through calculation, and expanded through force, now governed through legacy. Each decision now echoed forward, beyond her immediate grasp. Somewhere between the mountain passes and the palace walls, her body, once the axis of an empire, began to break down. Yet no formal record marked her final moments. The silence was not one of absence, but of intention. The queen who had redefined rule left no spectacle behind, only the machinery of power she had built still turning. Tamar's death left no proclamation. There was no royal decree, no public mourning, no solemn parade of officials through the capital. The queen who had expanded borders, broken precedent, and ruled with unwavering control was gone, and the court responded not with ceremony, but with stillness. Her passing, likely in late 1213, was shrouded in intentional silence. The chronicles, normally detailed and ceremonious in recording royal deaths, gave no precise date and offered no funeral procession. Even the location of her burial remains uncertain. Many believe her body was taken to Galati Monastery near Kutaisi, a spiritual and political center she had supported during her reign. Others suggest she rests in an unknown mountain chapel, chosen for its secrecy, but no tombstone bears her name. No public site marks her final breath. This was not an oversight. It was a decision. In Tbilisi, bells rang without explanation. Their sound carried across courtyards and market squares, but the reason remained unspoken. Within the palace, officials continued their duties. Scrolls were still sealed. Edicts were still issued. But the queen's name vanished from the documents for days. No one called for mourning. No one summoned the people. Her son, George IV, already crowned during her lifetime, assumed full control without formal transition. Yet even as he took the throne, the court remained shadowed by her absence. Advisors, generals, and nobles who had once questioned her right to rule now found themselves preserving her policies, quoting her judgments, relying on her decisions. Her rule had once been seen as a challenge to the natural order. Now it became the only framework they trusted to hold the state together. The political structure Tamar built continued to function, but with a new kind of weight. Her crown, once seen as too bold, now became a symbol of survival. Laws enacted under her name remained untouched. The clergy, once divided over her authority, now invoked her legacy as proof of divine order. George IV, though king in title, ruled in her shadow. He inherited more than a realm. He inherited the expectations of a generation shaped by her hand. Yet he did not possess the same influence. Where Tamar had governed through consensus and command, George moved cautiously. constrained by the memory of the woman who had come before him. The silence that followed her death was more than grief. It was a political tool, a way to delay uncertainty. By leaving no spectacle behind, Tamar left no opening for dispute. Her burial, concealed by secrecy, prevented it from becoming a rallying point for opposition or dissent. Her absence was managed not by denial, but by discipline. And still, the questions remained. In a kingdom where every church bore her mark and every reform carried her signature, there was no place the court could turn without being reminded of her rule. Tamar had become something more than a monarch. She had become an anchor, and in her silence, the state was left to measure its weight. Tamar's reign did not fade with her final breath. It multiplied. In the years that followed her death, her image passed from the realm of governance into the realm of legend. The chronicles written in her lifetime recorded victories, decrees, and alliances, but the centuries that followed added something more enduring: myth. Tamar became not only a queen of record, but a figure of devotion. The Georgian Orthodox Church canonized her as a saint, recognizing her not just for piety or patronage, but for the rare clarity with which she had ruled. In liturgy, her name was spoken with reverence. In memory, she rose beyond the limits of gender and title. Officially, she had ruled as Mepi, king, a term that defied category in a world where sovereign power was shaped in the likeness of men. Yet the title stuck. It was neither rejection nor flattery. It was a reflection of what she had imposed on the world around her, a new definition of strength. In the decades after her passing, the golden age she forged began to unravel. George IV, though young and willing, lacked her discipline. His reign was cut short by wounds suffered in foreign campaigns. The stability Tamar had enforced through negotiation and reform gave way to the pressures of external threats and internal fragmentation. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century would later devastate the region, pushing the kingdom into political submission. Successors struggled to maintain control over the vast territory she had once unified. Borders contracted, power shifted, and yet Tamar's legacy did not collapse with them. The physical structures of her era, monasteries, trade roads, stone bridges, and legal charters, outlived the reigns that followed. They stood as markers of a vision that had reached further than any ruler before her, and few after. Her influence stretched beyond geography. In the wider Orthodox world, Tamar was remembered as a defender of faith, a restorer of order, and a protector of holy lands. Her alliance with the newly formed Empire of Trebizond helped maintain Christian strongholds along the Black Sea after the fall of Constantinople. Her patronage of religious centers fortified Georgia's role in the spiritual life of the region. But her legacy was not confined to piety. It was political, judicial, and cultural. Tamar sponsored the arts at a scale unmatched in Georgian history. The era's literature, most notably Shota Rustaveli's The Knight in the Panther's Skin, captured the idealized image of her court, one of wisdom, moral clarity, and honor. Though the poem never names her directly, it was dedicated to her spirit. That spirit, firm, thoughtful, and unshaken, became the center around which the country's self-image turned. In times of crisis, Georgians looked backward to her reign, not as nostalgia, but as a standard. Her policies, once debated, became templates. Her judgments, once questioned, became precedent. Even as rulers came and went, and foreign empires rose and fell around them, Tamar's name held a singular weight. It stood for a Georgia that had once been whole, economically strong, militarily confident, and spiritually united. Her image, carved in frescoes and painted in manuscripts, was preserved not as a royal icon, but as a national anchor. Each time her story was retold, it was adjusted to match the needs of the present, but the core never changed. Tamar did not rule with spectacle. She ruled with control. She did not conquer through terror. She built through trust, through reform, through precision. In a world that rarely allowed women to lead, she did more than claim a throne. She redefined what it meant to occupy it. Her life became a mirror, reflected in the ambitions of those who followed and in the fears of those who never dared. Her strength was not loud, it was enduring. And in every cracked mosaic, in every weathered inscription, in every silence that follows her name, her shadow still lingers. Was Queen Tamar a savior or a shadow in history? The answer lies not in what she ruled, but in how long her absence continues to govern.